अध्यापन गरिरहनुभएका सम्पूर्ण गुरुवर्गज्यूहरू जस्तै सुगत कलेजमै अध्ययन गरिरहनुभएका नयाँ तथा पुराना विद्यार्थीहरू र त्यस्तै आजको हाम्रो गेस्ट लेक्चरको रूपमा आउनुभएका स्कलर मिस्टर एन्ड्रयू क्यान्टम, एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर अफ वेस्ली युनिभर्सिटी युएसए का हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँलाई समस्तमा त्यस्तै हाम्रा चाहिँ लोचावा पनि प्रसाद प्रकाशजी सर र अन्य गण्यमान्यहरूलाई म सुगत बुद्धिस्ट कलेजका प्राचार्य स्मिता बजाचार्यका हार्दिक न्यानो अभिवादन तथा जोजलपा गर्न चाहन्छु। हामीले सुगत बौद्ध महाविद्यालय कलेजमा विगतदेखि नै गेस्ट लेक्चर सिरिजमा सञ्चालन गरिँदै आइरहेका छौँ। आजको हाम्रो यो गेस्ट लेक्चर सिरिज हाम्रो 5औं पटकको हो। हामीले आज मिलारेपा को सन्दर्भमा बायोग्राफीको बारेमा चाहिँ हाम्रो एन्ड्रयू सरले चाहिँ भन्नुहुन्छ र यसबारे एन्ड्रयू सरको बारे उहाँले चाहिँ द हिस्टोरिज अफ द मिलारेपा'स बायोग्राफी सम्बन्धमा उहाँले चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ आज चाहिँ लेक्चर गर्नुहुन्छ र एन्ड्रयू क्यान्टम सरले चाहिँ बुद्धिस्ट लिटरेचर एन्ड हिस्ट्री, सेक्रेड जियोग्राफी एन्ड पिलग्रिमेज एन्ड भिजुअल कल्चर अफ द हिमालयनमा चाहिँ उहाँको धेरै चाहिँ कन्ट्रिब्युसन र आर्टिकलहरू धेरै छन् र उहाँको अध्ययन पनि यसैमा छ र उहाँले उहाँको अध्ययनको दौरानमा र उहाँले के कस्तो गरिरहनुभएका छन् र उहाँको छोटो परिचय दिनुहुनु। म यस कलेजका सञ्चालक समितिका सदस्य त्यस्तै यहाँका अध्यापक पनि र त्यस्तै सुगत बुद्धिस्ट रिसर्च कमिटीका कोअर्डिनेटर मिलन साके सरलाई चाहिँ केही मन्तव्य राखिदिनु र उहाँको बारेमा छोटो परिचय दिनुहुन म विनम्र अनुरोध गर्दछु।
धन्यवाद। First of all, I would like to pay my homage to the chief deity of this Mahavihara, Sakyamuni Buddha. Then I would like to, first of all, even if it is not my duty to welcome all the participants here, but really speaking, to be honest, I am today feeling very much ecstatic or very much exhilarated, to find you here, to have you here in this college, because I have been listening to the speeches and the lectures and the teachings of Professor Dr. Andrew Quintman, since maybe for a long time. I myself, I myself also having specializing or studying MILAREPA'S biography and his visit in Nepal and his meditation, his austerity, and MILAREPA is a name, MILAREPA is a name. Even if we recite or even if we actually recite or take the name of MILAREPA, a kind of uncontrollable or sincere or unbearable devotion actually arises in our mind. Such is the dynamic personality of Tibet's great yogi MILAREPA. So it is my privilege and honor to welcome you, sir, in this college. This college specializes in Mahayana Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism based on Sanskrit Buddhist literature, or you can say the Newar Buddhism. Newar Buddhism is actually synonymous with Sanskrit Buddhism, the only tradition surviving in Nepal today. And without spending much of the time, I have a lot of things to discuss with you, but there is a time constraint. You also have a very limited time, but in spite of all your busy schedules, you have actually made your time, or you have very compassionately, actually given your time to this college, so that all the participants, all the scholars here gathered in this lecture hall can listen to your lecture very jubilantly. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you very briefly to the public. I would like to take your permission to speak in Nepali language so that they can understand you better in Nepali language, you know? Because as far as English is concerned, everybody knows you. उहाँ हाम्रो आज एन्ड्रु क्विन्सम्यान सर यहाँ हुनुहुन्छ होइन, उहाँको नाम मात्रै काफी छ कि एकदम धुरन्धुर बौद्ध विद्वान हुनुहुन्छ। यसो हेर्दाखेरि उहाँ अहिले आएर हामी कहाँ आएर चाहिँ लेक्चर दिनुहुन्छ, साधारण व्यक्ति जस्तो हुनुहुन्छ होइन, तर त्यस्तो होइन। उहाँको तपाईँले चाहिँ नि गुगल गर्नुहोस् होइन, अथवा युट्युबमा चाहिँ खोज्नुहोस्, जहाँ पनि उहाँको चाहिँ नि लेक्चर स्पेसली अन मिलारेपा सम्बन्धी के त्यसमा मात्रै होइन, उहाँले अरू विषयमा पनि धेरै होइन उहाँले चाहिँ नि अब रिसर्च गर्नुभएको छ, उहाँले पढाउनु भएको छ होइन। तर म यहाँ उहाँको केही क्रिडेन्सियलहरू चाहिँ म यहाँ भन्न चाहन्छु। उहाँ तिब्बत र हिमालयन स्टडिज होइन, उहाँ चाहिँ उहाँ स्कलर हुनुहुन्छ होइन, उहाँ स्कलर हुनुहुन्छ। अनि उहाँ एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर इन द डिपार्टमेन्ट अफ रिलिजन एन्ड द कलेज अफ इस्टर्न एसियन स्टडिज इन वेस्टल्यान्ड युनिभर्सिटीमा चाहिँ उहाँ प्रोफेसर हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँले चाहिँ धेरै बुक्सहरू लेख्नु भएको छ। विशेष गरेर उहाँलाई चाहिँ नि चिन्ने होइन, उहाँलाई हामीले कुन बुकबाट चिन्ने भन्दाखेरि उहाँको यो बुक छ कि यो चाङलिङ हेरोकाको होइन लाइफ अफ मिलारेपा भन्ने। मैले जाने अनुसार, मैले बुझे अनुसार यो पाइनरिङ अनुवादक होइन, मिलारेपाको जीवनीको पाइनरिङ अनुवादक विशेष गरेर 3 जना छन् यहाँ होइन। 3 जना, अब एकजना इभान वेन्स भन्ने त अहिलेसम्म जीवित नै छन् कि छैनन् मलाई थाहा छैन है, उहाँ बितिसक्नुभयो कि मलाई थाहा भएन। अनि अर्को इङ्ग्लिस बायोग्राफी यो लोप्साङ लालुङपा भन्ने छ होइन, उहाँको पनि एकदम राम्रै बायोग्राफी हो मिलारेपाको जीवनी। अब चाङलिङ हेरोका भन्ने त्यो 4औं शताब्दी 15औं शताब्दीको आचार्य के अरे सिद्ध, तिब्बतको चाहिँ एउटा सिद्ध होइन, तिब्बतको एउटा सिद्ध मिलारेपाकै परम्पराबाट चाहिँ आएका एउटा सिद्ध 4औं शताब्दीको सिद्ध चाङलिङ हेरोकाले मिलारेपाको चाहिँ नि जीवनीलाई उहाँले विभिन्न, अब उहाँ हाम्रो पुण्य सरको अनुसार त 75वटा उहाँको विभिन्न एपिसोडहरू बायोग्राफिकल डिटेल्सहरू कम्पाइल गरेर उहाँले एउटा जीवनी नै तयार गर्नुभएको थियो कि चाङलिङ हेरोकाले होइन। अनि चाङलिङ हेरोकाले जीवनी तयार भएको त्यो तयार गर्नुभएको जीवनीलाई चाहिँ नि मिलारेपा नामथार भनिन्थ्यो कि, मिलारेपा नामथार भनिन्छ। अनि सौभाग्यवश त्यो जीवनी छ नि मिलारेपा नामथार चाहिँ नि मैले मेरो बुवासँगै मिलेर अनुवाद गरेको थिएँ कि धेरै पहिला, भनेपछि आजभन्दा 15-16 वर्षै अगाडि होला है। त्यो चाहिँ नि कर्पोरेट बडीबाट छापियो, त्यो चाहिँ नि तपाईँहरूको हातमा होला सायद सबैसँग, त्यो एकदमै पपुलर भएको थियो कि त्यो। तर अब मैले भनिहालेँ 3 जना मेरो आफ्नो धारणामा है, मेरो आफ्नो बिलिफमा 3 जना त्यस्तो एकदमै स्वनाम धन्य होइन मूर्धन्य व्यक्तिहरू मध्ये उहाँ एकजना हुनुहुन्छ, एन्ड्रु क्विन्सम्यान, मिलारेपाको चाहिँ यो बायोग्राफी एक्सपर्ट होइन। एक्सपर्ट मध्ये एउटा मैले नामै लिउँ, एउटा इभान वेन्सले चाहिँ नि यो टिबेट्स ग्रेट योगी मिलारेपा भनेर अनुवाद गर्नुभएको छ यो तिब्बतन भाषाबाट अनि इङ्ग्लिसमा। त्यो अलिकति यो अब यो पुरानो इङ्ग्लिस टाइपको कि बाइबलको चाहिँ नि अलिकति त्यो फ्लेभर छ त्यसमा होइन। अनि त्यस्तै अर्को अब उहाँको अलिकति एकदम त्यो भाषा चाहिँ नि क्लिष्ट भएको हुनाले पछि अर्को एकजना यो तिब्बतनै स्कलर होला सायद है, लोप्साङ लालुङपा भन्नेले अर्को बायोग्राफी चाहिँ उहाँले निकाल्नुभयो होइन, लाइफ अफ मिलारेपा भनेर। अनि अर्को यो चाहिँ बायोग्राफी छ यहाँले चाङलिङ हेरोका द लाइफ अफ मिलारेपा। यो 3वटा बायोग्राफी यति यो बेस्ट सेलर हो होइन, यति यो पपुलर छन् कि मिलारेपालाई जान्ने, मिलारेपाको चाहिँ जीवनी चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ अब बुझ्ने मेन लिटरेरी सोर्स भनेको यो 3वटा बायोग्राफी हो, किनकि तिब्बतन त सबैलाई आउँदैन नि होइन। त्यही भएर यो 3वटा बायोग्राफी मार्फत नै हामीले मिलारेपालाई पनि जान्न सक्छौँ। यो उहाँले चाहिँ यो मिलारेपा सम्बन्धी यसरी उहाँले एकदमै डुबेर होइन स्टडी गर्नुभएको छ। त्यही भएर मैले उहाँले चाहिँ मिलारेपा स्पेसलिस्ट नै भन्न रुचाउँछु कि होइन। अनि उहाँले अर्को किताब पनि लेख्नु भएको छ उहाँले, द योगिन एन्ड द म्याडम्यान भनेर कि, योगिन एन्ड द म्याडम्यान भनेर तिब्बतमा चाहिँ नि अब मिलारेपा भनेपछि चाहिँ नि अब श्रद्धाले चाहिँ शिर नझुकाउने कोही पनि छैन कि। मिलारेपा यो कुनै पनि ट्रेडिसनमा चाहिँ नि उहाँ बाँधिनु भएको छैन, सबै ट्रेडिसनमा चाहे त्यो गेलु हो, काली कागी हो, निमा हो, साक्या होस्, सबैले उत्तिकै श्रद्धाका साथ भक्तिका साथ चाहिँ पुज्नुहुन्छ। मिलारेपाको नाम मात्रै लिने बित्तिकै मान्छेको आँखाबाट बलिन्द्र आँसु नै झर्छ कि त्यति किसिमको चाहिँ उहाँहरूको मिलारेपाप्रति डिभोसन छ होइन। त्यो त्यही मिलारेपा सम्बन्धी उहाँले चाहिँ त्यो रिसर्च गर्नुभएको भएर मैले पहिल्यैदेखि नै उहाँलाई फलो गरिरहेको थिएँ होइन। अनि उहाँले अब एक्चुली त्यस्तै सपना हुन्छ नि सबैको होइन। एक्चुली उहाँले पर्सनली नै भेट्नु पाएको कति राम्रो हुन्थ्यो भन्ने मेरो विचार थियो कि पहिलेदेखि मेरो एउटा सपना हो। त्यही भएर आज उहाँलाई चाहिँ मैले भेटेँ होइन। तपाईँहरूले पनि भेट्नुभयो, एउटा यो सपना चाहिँ साकार भएको हो कि एक किसिमले भन्यो भने। अनि उहाँको अब धेरै टाइम चाहिँ नि हामीसँग छैन है। अब उहाँलाई चाहिँ पछि हामीले भेट्दै गरौँला। उहाँको युट्युब पनि हेर्नुहोस् तपाईँहरूले होइन। अहिले इन्टरनेटमा सर्च गर्नुभयो भने उहाँको चाहिँ एकदम छापछाप्ती धेरै नै आर्टिकलहरू होइन किताबहरू चाहिँ तपाईँले चाहिँ पढ्न सक्नुहुन्छ। त्यो हाम्रो कलेजमा उहाँ आएर चाहिँ यसरी लेक्चर दिनु भनेको हाम्रो लागि एउटा ठुलो अहोभाग्य हो कि। कहाँबाट यो उहाँले चाहिँ हो पुण्य सरले चाहिँ गर्दाखेरि मैले अब अस्ति उहाँले चाहिँ फोन गर्नुभयो कि ल अहिले उहाँ एन्ड्रु कुनमान सर चाहिँ यहाँ नेपालमा आउनु भएको छ है, तपाईँहरूले अब मौकाको फाइदा उठाउनुहोस्, नत्र उहाँ तुरन्तै जानुहुन्छ अनि पछि चाहिँ अब कहिले भेट्ने होइन भनेर मैले भन्ने बित्तिकै म्यामलाई फोन गरेर अनि त्यो 2 दिनमा मिलाएको यो लेक्चर। त्यही भएर हामीले यो आज एकदमै उहाँको चाहिँ ठुलो हाम्रो यो अवसर जोडेको छ, महत्त्वपूर्ण दिन हो। तपाईँहरूले एकदम एटेन्टिभली ध्यान दिएर सुन्नुहोस् होइन। अनि उहाँसँग चाहिँ नि तपाईँहरूले कम्युनिकेट गर्ने कोसिस गर्नुहोस्, कन्ट्याक्ट गर्ने कोसिस गर्नुहोस् कि उहाँ त्यस्तो ठुल्ठुलो एकदम संसारकै धुरन्धर महाविद्वानहरू होइन यति हतपति चाहिँ यहाँ आएर यसले लेक्चर चाहिँ दिनुहुन्न कि यो हाम्रो लागि ठुलो चान्स हो यो। एन्ड आई वुड लाइक टु स्पिक अ फ्यु वर्ड्स इन इङ्ग्लिस अल्सो बिकज I listened to MILAREPA'S biography when I was a child, maybe of 8 or 9 years old. My father used to tell the story of MILAREPA, especially during Dasai time, when there was no work at all. So every night I listened to the biography of MILAREPA from my father. And my father could teach the story of MILAREPA in such a way that every time when we listen to the biography of MILAREPA, episode of MILAREPA, and everything that MILAREPA underwent, during his search for enlightenment, and during his earlier age, after he came into contact with his guru, Marpa Lotawa, and he actually got the teachings from Marpa Lotawa, and he actually went into a austere retreat, or a very difficult retreat in the forlorn mountains, and ultimately, due to the blessing of, or due to the teaching of his Guru Marpa Lotawa, he attained enlightenment of a Buddha in a single lifetime by following the Vajrayana teachings imparted by Marpa Lotawa. So when we listen to the biography of Milarepa, especially myself with my family, because we must, at the time my father used to tell me we must make use of our precious human body, so we must listen to the teachings and the biography of the great siddhas of the past, so that we may have some kind of predispositions in our mind, so that we will also attain enlightenment in the future time, if not possible in this time. So I listened to the biography of Milarepa, and every time when I listened to the biography of Milarepa, I was burst into tears. Such a natural and spontaneous devotion arise in me, including my family. And later I decided to make this life story available to the public, so that they also can actually give rise to devotion or something like that. So due to the blessing of my root guru and Milarepa himself, so that dream came true. So in that way, I'm also now on the boards of releasing my another book on Milarepa's Doha. That's a song of realization. So in the near future, that book also is going to be released, and that the first part of Mila Gurbum. So with that, I would not like to talk further. I would like to begin the presentation, a very excellent and very rare presentation. And so I'm going to hand this mic over to the sir.
So I'm going to try, it's a small room. If I speak like this, can you hear me? Okay? Okay. So maybe we'll...
Your voice is louder.
Okay. So my daughter is studying theater now, and she's taught me to project my voice. So I learned something from her. So thank you very much for the very, very kind introduction. It is such an honor and pleasure to be here in Sugata Buddhist University, Buddhist College. So first of all, I would like to extend my thanks to the chairman, directors, the professors, students, and of course all of my friends here. Thank you for coming to listen to this talk. I should start by saying I'm also a little bit embarrassed to be speaking to you while I myself consider myself to be a guest in your country. It's a place I have a deep love for, and yet I'm not able to speak to you in your own language, so I feel very humbled that I must speak to you in English. I hope next time I come to speak to you I can lecture in Nepali. That's my aspiration. I'm also very thankful to be here because
Line in.
because it connects to my own history of spending time in Nepal. I was very fortunate to come for the first time to Kathmandu nearly 35 years ago. And at that time I was a student in college, and I came on a program to study Himalayan culture and history and Buddhism. And my teacher at that time was someone many of you may be familiar with. His name was Hubert de Clear. And he directed a program called SIT, School for International Training. And at that time, during my studies, my thesis for that program was about the history of Milarepa in Nepal. So it was researching some of the places that Milarepa visited when he came to Nepal. I was very, very fortunate some years later to come back to Nepal, that time as a co-director of the program together with Hubert de Clear. And Hubert himself also had a long interest and a love for the story of Milarepa, his life, and the places of Milarepa, felt great devotion towards him. And I also know that Hubert and Milan Shakyaji's father, Minbardur Shakya, had very close relationship, and they deeply valued the idea of communication between scholars to develop interest in different traditions, and had a very long and fruitful career of communication. And it's in the spirit of that model, and it's really in keeping the work of Minbardur Shakya and Hubert de Clear in mind, that I would like to dedicate this lecture and speak to you all. So I have a few things that I'd like to talk to you about today in the life of Milarepa. I should start by saying I've spent so long researching about the life story and the songs of Milarepa, the places of Milarepa in Tibet and Nepal, almost 35 years, that I no longer know what to say about him. But I'd like to talk briefly about a few different things. So first, I'd like to talk about the main figures of the story. So one is Milarepa himself, and the other is the famous author that Milanji introduced you to. His name is Tsongyun Haruka. And I refer to them as the Yogin Milarepa and the madman Tsongyun Haruka. Madman because he presented himself as a kind of mad saint, as a kind of crazy wisdom. And I'll say more about that. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the early history of the life of Milarepa. And I'll show you some examples of early texts that tell different stories about Milarepa's life. And finally, I'd like to take one small example of how to very carefully and closely read the life story that might teach us something new about the story that might not be so obvious. Okay, so before I do that, I want to say one final thing. I'm a professor in university in America. My department is not Buddhist studies. My department is religious studies. So we teach students about how to think about, how to develop questions about religions around the world, and how they influence people's approach to life, to society, to creating institutions, to understanding history. And I would like to at the very beginning, to make one suggestion to you all. And that suggestion is that it's possible to read religious texts like the life of Milarepa, feeling, on the one hand, feeling great devotion, to feel great warmth and affection for the story and those figures, to read it as a Buddhist, as I do myself, on the one hand. But on the other hand, to also ask difficult questions about the individuals and about the stories. We can ask difficult questions about where those stories came from, about how they changed over time, about why they're presented in the way that they do. That is, to think about those stories critically, to think about the relationship of religion and history, religion and politics, religion and society. And to ask those difficult questions does not damage or harm our sense of devotion and our sense of closeness to the tradition, but from my experience actually increases our sense of devotion. That we can take the path of practitioner and the path of scholar, and they really go side by side, hand in hand. So sometimes I've published some things about Milarepa, about his life story, some practitioners didn't like so much, because they contradict what the stories tell us. But actually that is the job of the scholar, is to understand history and to present the truth of history alongside the truth of religion, and to see them both as important and how they influence each other. So let me start by saying a little bit about the stories, about the literature of Milarepa. So we can talk about what I call the corpus or collection of stories of Milarepa, and there are several different texts. The most famous one, translated as The Life of Milarepa, and Milanji described the early English translations and my own translation, and Milanji's own translation into Nepali. This comes from a Tibetan text called The Life of Milarepa, and it was written quite late. It was written in the 15th century, so finished in the year 1488, long after Milarepa had died. And this story, The Life of Milarepa, is a kind of story that is frequently written in Tibet. It's the story of a great saint, of a Buddhist saint. And Tibetans call that kind of a story a namtar. Namtar means liberation, or complete liberation, vimoksha in Sanskrit. And there are hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of biographies of namtars written in Tibetan, one of the most important kind of Tibetan forms of writing. The Life of Milarepa, I think, is maybe the most famous, in part because it is so engaging, it's written so beautifully, it seems so direct and immediate, and we'll talk about why that is. But so The Life of Milarepa is the story of Milarepa's life, from his childhood to his early years, to his struggles and performing of difficult trials, to his meditation, his awakening, his teaching disciples through song, through doha, spontaneous songs of realization, and eventually his death. So the story of a saint from birth, awakening to death. And it looks very much like the life of the Buddha. In fact, it was modeled after the life of the Buddha. There is another text, a kind of parallel or a companion text. And that is often translated as the 100,000 songs of Milarepa. And that comes, the 100,000 songs is a Tibetan term, the Gur Boom. So Gur is doha, it's a kind of spiritual song. Boom means 100,000 in Tibetan, but that's not a literal term. There are not actually 100,000 songs. It means all of them collected together. So we might think of this as the collection of all of the songs that Milarepa used to teach his disciples. And it's a very large collection with more than 60 chapters. Every chapter has a story of Milarepa meeting a disciple and the songs that he sings as a kind of teaching. They're very beautiful, it's very extensive, and this is where we find accounts of Milarepa coming to places in Nepal, Kathmandu Valley, to Yomo, Helambu, to Nubri and Sum and other places. All of those are recorded in the 100,000 Songs. These are the two most famous. There's also another collection of materials, of stories and of songs that were not included in those previous texts. And they were compiled later, a little bit later. In Tibetan, these are called the miscellaneous stories, the Sung Torbu. And these are things that did not get put in the other collections, but later authors thought they were also important, and they published them about a generation after the first text came out. So it's really the life story and the 100,000 songs that form the collection of Milarepa's teachings. And they're the stories that are so famous in Tibet and the Himalayan world in Nepal, and now also in the West. So to understand the life of Milarepa, we should say a few words about the historical figure of Milarepa. Many of you, I know, are familiar with the famous life story and his religious life, so I don't want to spend time saying much about that. But I'd like to say a few things about what we know about Milarepa from the perspective of history. And that actually is an easy question to answer because we know very little about Milarepa as a historical person. In fact, we know almost nothing about Milarepa as a historical person. One reason for that is that we have no historical writings from the time that Milarepa lived that describe him as a historical person. And this is very complicated. In some ways it's very similar to the figure of Shakyamuni Buddha. We have many, many stories about Shakyamuni's life. We have many versions of his life story, his previous lives, the Jatakas, and his final life on earth. And those stories are very meaningful. And yet, from a perspective of history, they don't tell us much about who he was as a historical figure. The same is true about Milarepa. The first recorded writings that we have that may have come from Milarepa himself are at least from a generation later. So, maybe even 100 years later. So there's a kind of gap between when he lived and died and when the writings about his life began to appear. I've given you a few slides here just to set the historical context. So the painting here comes actually from a very famous monument. If you've read the life of Milarepa, you know during his training with Marpa, he was forced to undergo a trial, the very difficult trial of building these immense towers. So I was very fortunate to go to the place where Milarepa did this work many times. This is known as Sekar Gutok, or the tower made for Marpa, his guru's son, that is 9 stories tall. So Milarepa's tower still exists. You can see the tower in the center. And it's now surrounded by a giant monastery that was built much later by a famous Tibetan Lama named Pao Tsuklachangpa. So in that monastery, we have one of the earliest painted portraits of Milarepa, maybe from the 13th century. I think it may be the earliest, certainly the earliest mural painting, so painting on a wall, but maybe one of the earliest paintings ever made of Milarepa. So from the mid-1200s, but still that is at least 200 years after Milarepa died. And I want to point out one feature here I'll come back to later in the talk. You look at how Milarepa is presented here. He's wearing the white robe of a meditator, a repa. Repa is the Tibetan means a robe of white cotton cloth. That was a mark of not of a scholar or a monk, but a meditator. So he's shown as a meditator, cross-legged position, like the Buddha. And yet he's not in the position that we always associate with Milarepa, with his hand to his ear in the gesture of singing. Instead, how is he presented? Well, one hand is in the Bhumisparsha mudra, touching the earth like the Buddha awakening. And the other hand is in the gesture of teaching. Again, teaching like the Buddha. It's a very different imagination of who Milarepa is. Someone who is enlightened and someone who teaches. And this representation, we can say iconography, would change later on. And I'll give an example of that later. So that's Milarepa. Also, we can see that the dates of Milarepa are also very difficult to understand. You see many different kinds of dates. I've written an article about the different, if you're very interested, you can read about that. I'll offer one copy to the library. The dates that I use are the ones here, but just to understand, you see different dates sometimes, and there are reasons why you might use each one of those. So Milarepa is the yogin. He's a great meditator. The second figure in the story is who I often refer to as the madman. And that story, that name comes from the name he used himself. Sang-nyun Heruka. So Heruka is a term I'm sure you're familiar with. Heruka, the wrathful, blood-drinking deity. Sang-nyun is a Tibetan name that means the mad saint, Nyumpa, from Tsang. Tsang is a region of western Tibet. So Sang-nyun was not his given name, but a name he adopted himself and was given to him that demonstrates that he was not an ordinary teacher and not an ordinary meditator, but someone who exhibited a kind of crazy wisdom. He presented himself like the great Siddhas or Mahasiddhas of ancient India who embodied the practice of Vajrayana Buddhism. So Tsongyen Heruka lived many centuries after Milarepa, more than 4 centuries after Milarepa. And yet he was totally inspired by Milarepa's life. Tsongyen Heruka began as a monk. He trained at many monasteries in central and western Tibet. But eventually he realized that intellectual studies alone would not lead to liberation. Instead, he must practice meditation like Milarepa. And so he gave up his monastic robes, and he spent many, many years meditating in solitude, in mountain caves, and high mountain peaks in the jungles of a region of Tsari on the border of Tibet and India. And he adopted the lifestyle, the unconventional lifestyle of a great Mahasiddha, like the Mahasiddhas of India, like Tilopa and Naropa and other great Siddhas that I'm sure you're familiar with. And when he re-emerged from his meditation retreat, he had a new kind of mission. Part of that mission was to recreate or to re-inspire the tradition of dedication to meditation that Milarepa represented. He wanted to re-establish the lifestyle of the yogin meditator. Now we have to remember, at the time when Tsongyen Heruka lived, in the late 1400s, was a time in Tibet when there were giant monasteries. The big monasteries of Lhasa were just being built. They had 10,000 monks, 12,000 monks, 13,000 monks. They were like monastic cities. There were also great lamas. They were recognized reincarnations called tulkus, who were very powerful. They were great spiritual teachers, but also had great political power. And they were great centers of economic power. So massive monasteries, powerful monastic teachers. This was a kind of Buddhism Tsongyen Heruka disagreed with. He really wanted to reestablish not the big monasteries, but the path of the solitary meditator. And the path of meditation of the yogin was illustrated in the life of Milarepa. And so Songyun Haruka himself went to visit many of the meditation places of Milarepa. He did meditation there. He eventually went to the valley of Kirong, of Mangyo Gungtang, just up from Rasoagati, that leads to the border of Nepal. And while he was there, he had this kind of vision and inspiration while meditating in the place of Milarepa's birth, that I should write a new version of Milarepa's life, in part to inspire people to adopt the life of Milarepa. And moreover, he said that I will write a version of Milarepa's life that is modeled after the life of the Buddha. And so he spent many years writing the text. Of course, he did not only write it, he produced the wood blocks to print them and distribute them. This was very, very expensive, very difficult, took many, many years. But eventually he did, and the story that Songyun Haruka, the madman, told, the life of Milarepa, the collected songs of Milarepa, became the most famous account of Milarepa in the Himalayan world. In Tibet, you might say it was a bestseller. I think it became the most famous book in Tibet. And of course it became famous throughout the Himalayan world. It was famous in Bhutan, in India, in Nepal, and now also in the West. Since the 1920s, became famous in the West also. So to understand why the life of Milarepa is so important, in part as a historian, we need to understand the relationship between Milarepa, the yogin, the practitioner, and Songyun Haruka, who is the author of those stories. And so I'll talk a little bit about their relationship later at the end of this talk. Okay. So when we think about the life of Milarepa, we always think about the version that Songyun Haruka himself wrote, this version. And it was, remember, it was written almost 400 years after Milarepa died. So, if you want to understand who Milarepa is as a historical person, this is not a very good guide to that, in part because it was written so many years, many hundreds of years after Milarepa died. It is a very moving account of Milarepa's life. It tells us many profound and important stories and records his teachings. But just we need to remember that it was written long after Milarepa died. And instead, what we might do is look for earlier versions of the life of Milarepa. That there are many versions of those early stories, but they never became as famous as Songyun Haruka's. So let me say a little bit about some of those early versions. There are many accounts of Milarepa's life. The earliest accounts we have that may have been written by Milarepa's own disciples are often very short, sometimes only a few pages. They certainly do not tell the long story with all of the details and record all of the songs. So there are many, many dozens, maybe even hundreds of those short accounts. But what is interesting for us are the larger accounts, the accounts that do tell a long, complicated story of Milarepa's life, and they collect many of those songs. Now what's interesting, there is one early version. The text itself claims it was written by Milarepa's own disciples, by 12 of his very closest disciples. And this version is called the 12 Great Disciples version, the story written by Milarepa's 12 senior disciples. And if that is true, that is one of our earliest works. And what's interesting is that it looks similar to this account and to the 100,000 songs, but it has many interesting differences. And those differences were then cut out or edited out by Tsongyun Haruka. So one version of this text we have, this is a manuscript in a museum in the United States. And you can see that it's written in block print Tibetan letters, but also has many illustrations. And interestingly, many early versions of the life of Milarepa have these kinds of illustrations. And I've chosen for you a chapter here you are probably familiar with, and it's Milarepa's meeting with the famous hunter Repa, Kira Gompo Dorje. And Kira Repa himself is said to have been Nishangba from the region of Manang in northwest Nepal. And it's this encounter that Milarepa has first with a deer and a hunting dog, and later the huntsman Kira Repa. And Milarepa teaches to the deer, teaches Dharma to the dog, and then of course teaches Dharma to the fierce huntsman, and converts all of them to Buddhism that became so famous. One of the most famous stories associated with Milarepa. And you can see that story is illustrated here. I don't have a pointer, I'm sorry, but Milarepa is sitting in his cave in Nishang, and the deer, the dog, and Kira Gompo Dorje find Milarepa meditating. Here's the deer, and there's the dog, and here he has taught Dharma to them, and they're sitting by his side, and then Kira Gompo Dorje comes with his arrow ready to shoot, and Milarepa sings a great doha, a great song of realization, and eventually converts. On the next page you'll see Kira Repa is wearing the white robe. He's been converted to Buddhism, and he's given up, offered up his arrows and bows and his dog and his deer, and followed Milarepa as a great disciple. And we find that in later versions of great collections of the life and songs of Milarepa, and these collections are very interesting. They refer to themselves as a kind of black treasury. And black treasury here has a very specific meaning. The black treasury, or Dzönak in Tibetan, was a temple that was created by a great Tibetan Lama known as the Karmapa, a name many of you may know. And the story here is that the tradition of this version, perhaps written by Milarepa's own disciple, was transmitted to the line of Karmapas very early on as a kind of secret transmission. In Tibetan they call Nyengyut, or Garna Tantra, the ear-whispered Tantra, meaning that it was secret and could only be taught to one disciple, from one teacher to one disciple in a given generation. And in fact, we find some of these life stories connected with collections of tantric teachings as a kind of introduction to the masters of that tradition. So some of the texts in that lineage, the Black Treasury lineage, tell similar stories, but also with alternate accounts. So here's another example, also illustrated, and it's that same chapter. The huntsman and the deer of Kira Gompo Dorje, and we see Milarepa and the deer and the hunting dog, and there's Kira Gompo Dorje with his bow and arrow about to offer them up out of his devotion. Now what's really interesting in these early versions, we find stories that don't appear anywhere else in the famous collection. For example, in an alternate story in this collection, it tells basically the same version. Milarepa meets the deer and teaches Dharma. He meets the hunting dog and teaches him Dharma. He meets the fierce hunter and teaches him Dharma, and they all become converted to Buddhism, and they all follow Milarepa as his guru. In this alternate version, there's another character who appears, and that is Kira Gompo Dorje's wife. And she appears also as this very fierce woman. And her husband has just given up. He's offered his bow and arrow to Milarepa out of devotion. And his wife appears furious that her husband will no longer bring home the game of a deer that will feed their family. And she says, how could you do this? How could I sent you out hunting? How could you give up not only your bow and arrow, but give up your hunting dog and the deer that will feed our family for weeks to come? And she says, I not only will kill this so-called yogi, I will cut your head off too. And of course, Milarepa sees this, and he sings her a doha, a song of realization, and she also then becomes converted to Buddhism and becomes her disciple. And the story tells us she goes on to become like a great arhat. She becomes enlightened herself. So here's an interesting example of a female disciple who herself becomes a devotee of Milarepa. She's also Nishangpa, so Nepali. She comes from Nepal. And she goes on to become a great enlightened master herself. Now, for some reason, that story was cut and not included in the famous collection that Songyun Haruka published. And it's one reason why it's important for us to go back to the early sources, because we may find accounts that we wouldn't know otherwise. So one thing that Songyun Haruka did that changed the way the life of Milarepa developed was that he not only wrote the life story, but he printed the life story. So this was in the late 1400s, and in Tibet, printing existed, but it was still very new technology. Printing was very time-consuming. So I should say that printing had been around for a long, long time. The first printing, in fact, in the world took place in the context of Buddhism in Korea, with the printing on wood blocks of certain amulets, and then of the Diamond Sutra was also printed in East Asia. Printing existed in China even before the turn of the first millennium. So 8th, 9th century there was printing in China. They even had movable type printing long before Gutenberg developed movable type in Europe. But in Tibet, in central Tibet, printing came quite late. And it was very expensive. In order to print a book, you needed to cut the trees. You needed carpenters to cut trees, and from the trees to make rectangular blocks. You needed a scribe to write the text on paper. You would take the paper and paste it on the wood. You needed carvers to carve the wood. You needed paper makers to make the paper. Paper came from China and also came from Nepal. You needed ink makers to make the ink. Then you needed the printers to take the paper and the ink, and then you could print one side and the other side, and that was one page, and then you printed all of the pages. It was very, very expensive, and it took a long time. And Songyun Haruka worked very hard to get patronage from local kings and local Buddhist leaders in order to finish this project. But his innovation was that he made woodblock prints of the life story and the 100,000 songs. And what did this let him do? Well, it let him circulate, to make offerings of his story to many places, all of his patrons throughout Tibet and down into the Himalayan world received copies of his life story. So suddenly, everyone had a copy, had a version of Milarepa's story. And which version? It was this version. What would become the most famous version. So we can thank, in part, the technology of printing for this story to become so famous. Songyun Haruka also created new rituals about the life of Milarepa. In part, he created a kind of guru yoga in honor of Milarepa. And he also commissioned the painting of tankas, of religious paintings that demonstrated the life of Milarepa. And he would send these very carefully very strategically to all of the monastic leaders and all of the patrons of Buddhism. So suddenly, where there were once many versions of Milarepa's story, now there was one version that had become most famous, and that was Songyun Haruka's version. So we no longer have extant a copy of Songyun Haruka's original woodblock print. Maybe it exists somewhere, but we don't have an example of it. What we do have is the earliest example. So Songyun Haruka himself, he printed, and then in the few decades after, there were many, many new woodblock prints that were made. So one version, just a few decades later, was printed also close to the border of Nepal in a famous meditation place called Oselkup in 1538. And this is one example of one of the first pages of Milarepa. And it has illustrations of Milarepa, like many Tibetan woodblock prints do. The first pages have illustrations. So I want us to look here at the illustration of Milarepa and see if it looks familiar. Remember I showed you that early mural painting of Mila? So here we have a woodblock print of Mila, and it's kind of similar. There are some differences, but you can see the main thing is that his hand is in the gesture of teaching, in the Dharma Chakra Mudra. So he's presented as a teacher. What you don't see is this famous gesture of him as a singer. And yet, if we look just a few years later at another woodblock print that was made at another famous hermitage associated with the life of Milarepa, Chakartaso, a place that I'm doing research on now, we see a change. And here, maybe for the first time, we see a circulated, printed image of Milarepa with the iconography that would become standard, by which he would forever become known. With his hand to his ear, in the gesture of singing. It's the gesture by which a singer can listen to her or his own voice. So in the classical Hindustani tradition, you could hear your own voice by pressing your ear. There are other explanations for why this gesture is used, but it's very unusual, or really only associated with Milarepa and with figures who present themselves as reincarnations of Milarepa. So that is to say that the iconography of Milarepa also changed around the time of Songyun Haruka. And my theory is that really it was from Songyun Haruka that this new iconography appeared. Okay, another interesting example of how to think about the history of Milarepa and how it develops. Let me give one more example of a text before I turn to the last part of my talk in reading the life story of Milarepa. There's a very famous collection of Doha associated with the lineage of Milarepa, and that is called the Ocean of Kagyu Songs, the Kagyu Gurtso. And this was compiled by another master in the lineage of Karmapas, the 8th Karmapa, Mikyo Dorje. Oh, sorry, it's not Mike Dorje. That was an autocorrect mistake. Sorry for that. In the 1500s. And this, as the name suggests, is a collection of Doha of Gur, or of songs, of spiritual songs, associated with Milarepa and all of the masters of his lineage. And Milarepa is prominent in that collection too. And I want to show you an example of a very beautiful manuscript that I came upon, not from Tibet or even Nepal, but from Bhutan. And it's another example of how the tradition of Milarepa now lives as a kind of active and practiced tradition, how the tradition that Songyun Haruka created now lives on in the practiced tradition. So this is a unique collection of songs that's maintained, it's held in a small temple monastery in central Bhutan, near Tongsa, Bhutan. And it has a combination of different elements that is really unique. So here you see there's a recording of different songs of Milarepa. And then there are these beautiful illustrations that evoke the scene in which Milarepa may have sung his composition. And here you see Milarepa is singing to his master, to his guru Marpa. But also you see a notation in Tibetan called yang yik, a kind of chanting notation. This is quite unusual for Doha texts, and it describes the kind of melody, the approach of chanting that the reciter should adopt. And so it's a sort of combination of practices of reading the story, of evoking mentally the environment in which that song took place, but also the particular melody in which one should sing. So quite beautiful. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the background, the history, the figures of Milarepa and the author and editor of these texts, Sangye Haruka. I've talked a little bit about the historical development of those texts. I want to end by reading a very short passage from the life of Milarepa to illustrate how we might think about the story in new ways. And this adopts a perspective of a kind of literary studies, but also of Buddhist studies. So taking a kind of deep reading, a very close reading of the story. And in fact, it's the very first sentence of this story. So, if you look at the famous translation by the Tibetan translator into English, Lobsang Palungpa, he was a great pioneer of translation. He produced a beautiful version in English. But I always thought it was amazing. He left out and did not translate the very first sentence of the text, which in some ways is the most important. And this is that sentence. It's very short and you all will recognize it. And that sentence is, "Thus did I hear at one time." Thus did I hear at one time. So here's that passage for you. And I'll read it, just so we all have it in mind. "Thus have I heard," I translated in a slightly different way. This is my translation. "Thus have I heard, at one time, the powerful Lord of Yogins, the great Haruka himself, greatly renowned as Jetsun Milarepa, was residing in the sacred place called Belly Cave, that's Drupapuk close to Nyelam, on the border with Nepal, in the region of Nyenam, turning the wheel of the great vehicle Mahayana Dharma, seated in the midst of his heart disciple yogins," and then there's a list of all of his disciples who were seated there. So here's the first sentence. "Thus have I heard." This sounds familiar to you, I assume. Yeah? Where do you find that sentence proclaimed? Where have you heard that before? Evam Maya Shrutam. And here we go. So it is the sentence that begins every Buddhist sutta and sutra. The most important phrase in Buddhist literature. In Tibetan, Dike Daki Tupa Duchikna Evam Maya Shrutam. And for commentators of Buddhist literature, this is referred to as the Ubodhgata, or in Tibetan, the Lenglong. We might call it the scriptural opening. It sets the context for what follows, in part by authorizing it, by presenting it and proving what follows as authoritative Buddhist scripture. So in Buddhist literature, we refer to that as Buddha Vachana, right? Buddha voice, the speech of the Buddha, the authentic speech of the Buddha. And for a scripture, for a sutra to be authentic, it must be considered Buddha Vachana, to be voiced by the Buddha. And of course, I know that many of you know this. This is very complex. It often means that it was literally spoken by the Buddha himself, but it can also be inspired speech. It can be spoken by through the inspiration of the Buddha. But it must be considered Buddha Vachana, and that is marked by the statement evam maya shrutam, or thus have I heard. And I'll come back to this. So if we look at the next part of this text, at one time the Lord of Yogins, the great Heruka himself, and so forth. This also comprises a very specific element of Buddhist scripture. This is the scriptural setting, or the lengshi. And what it does is it presents the context, the historical context in which the Buddha gave his sermon. So that it didn't just happen out of nowhere, it happened at a certain place and a certain time. And so we might read in some Buddhist sutras, at one time the Buddha was residing in Great Vulture Peak, and at that time he was surrounded by a gathering, by a sangha of bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, and so on and so forth. And we find that exactly mirrored in the opening of Tsongyön Heruka's Life of Milarepa. This is something totally unique. No other author of Milarepa's life story made this claim, presented this kind of language. So the text begins, "Thus have I heard." And we know this is a statement of authority, of Buddha Vachana. It proves that what follows is an authoritative Buddhist scripture. But what's interesting for us here in the life of Milarepa is to understand who is I in this context. Now this is a really important context question in the context of the interpretation of Buddhist scripture. And Buddhist commentators spend a lot of time understanding how we make sense of this phrase, "Thus have I heard." Who is the I in "Thus have I heard"? Well, in general, we might think of that individual as the rapporteur. That's the English word. In Tibetan, is referred to as the gatherer of the Buddha's word, the Ga Dupapo, the one who collects or gathers what the Buddha has taught. It's the individual who has directly heard and brought together, remembered, and then brought together what the Buddha actually taught. And as we know, for most Buddhist scriptures, for most Buddhist Mahayana scriptures, that figure is Ananda himself. Ananda was the great disciple of the Buddha, said to have been present in every sermon the Buddha gave. And during the first Buddhist council, he stood before the Sangha and he recited the words of the Buddha from his perfect memory. And so, "Thus have I heard" presents Ananda's own perfect experience, perfect memory of what the Buddha actually taught. But in the context of the life of Milarepa, of course we know it cannot be Ananda. This is a story that takes place in Tibet. Of course Ananda wasn't present. So who is the I in "Thus have I heard"? Well, in the early English literature, early scholars of the life of Milarepa had a theory that it was actually Rinpoche. That is, Milarepa's disciple Rinpoche. Why? Because in the beginning of the story, if you read the life of Milarepa, Rinpoche requests Milarepa to tell his story. But that's not really fitting because Rinpoche is not associated with the writing of the story at all. So my particular reading of this introductory statement is that the I here is the author himself, Tsongyön Heruka. Our author in the late 1400s, the great Mahasiddha who developed and promoted Milarepa's tradition, was putting himself as an authoritative figure in recording and telling the life of Milarepa. And we can say just a few more words about why that might be the case. Tsongyun Haruka spent his life cultivating the style of yogic meditation practice that Milarepa practiced. He spent his life traveling and documenting all of the places associated with Milarepa. He spent his life building up the tradition of the yogi meditator. But he also had a very special relationship, we might say, with Milarepa. So if you read the biography of Tsongyun Haruka himself, he talks about how in his early years, while in deep meditation retreat, he had a vision in which Milarepa appears and narrates his life story. So in a sense, Tsongyun Haruka did hear the life of Milarepa directly from his subject of his biography, directly from Milarepa himself. So that's one way in which there's a direct connection. But there actually is one more connection that is even closer. There's one time when a disciple of Tsongyun Haruka says to him, "You are such a great teacher. You must be a reincarnation of a great master. Can you please tell us whose reincarnation you are?" And Tsongyun Haruka was kind of a trickster and a jokester, and he didn't want to answer directly. And so instead he says, well, if you go to the retreat place in which I stayed of Lapchi, I'm sure the place you know, on the border between Nepal and Tibet, famous place of Milarepa, if you go to the meditation caves of Lapchi and look at the footprints there, you'll know whose incarnation I am. And of course those footprints are Milarepa's. But at the end of Tsongyun Haruka's life, just before he passes away, he gathers all of his disciples together. And in his final pronouncement, he says to his disciples, you should consider, don't grieve, don't be upset, don't fear that you are losing your teacher. You should be happy and grateful that you have had the chance to study the true and perfect Dharma. And moreover, that you have received the Dharma from Milarepa himself. So very clearly, Tsongyun Haruka considered himself to be an embodiment, a manifestation of Milarepa. And we know that the Tibetan tradition later echoed that. There are later Tibetan writers who regard Tsongyun Haruka as a reincarnation of Milarepa. So again, thus have I heard, it is in a sense Tsongyun Haruka telling the life of Milarepa, and that story is also his own story. And this is where I want to end, going back to the idea of biography of Namtar. So the life of Milarepa is often considered, is titled a biography. It is a Namtar, that's in the title, that is given to it in Tibetan. And yet, if you read carefully, we know that the story is presented as Milarepa telling his own story. Milarepa narrates the accounts of his life. And in that sense, the story is not a biography, but instead an autobiography. Milarepa is telling his own life. And in Tibetan, that is a rangi namtar, telling one's own life story. So, it's an autobiography, Milarepa telling his own story, but we know in fact that it's a biography because it was written by the madman 400 years after Milarepa died. And yet, if you read carefully and you understand the historical context of the author and the subject of that story, we come to understand again that it actually is a kind of autobiography. Tsongyun Haruka is telling the life of Milarepa, but that life is also his own life. And it presents a kind of authority to his version of the life of Milarepa. And I think this is one reason why the generations of people who came to read the life of Milarepa after Tsongyun Haruka came to understand this version as so important, as so powerful, as so deeply embodying the life of Milarepa. And honestly, I think it's one of the reasons why I became so fascinated with this story and have spent so many years now trying to understand it myself. So I think I should stop. I've talked for a very long time. So thank you for your attention, and I would love to hear any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, sir, for your precious teaching for all.
People know about this in my religion, and I thank you all for attending this lecture program today, especially the Professor Andrew Whitman, and he's a Buddhist scholar, and Milarepa, this guru, is Rinpoche, is a very renowned person, and he is so renowned that people used to say as madman. He knows all of the things which is imagined by the people. So it is not necessary to explain again about the Milarepa, and I thank you all for attending this lecture program, and that this is most important program for the students as well as for teachers to know about the Mahayan religion, and thank you all.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, you can take this opportunity to ask.
Please, yes.
Thank you, Professor Andrew, for squeezing 35 years of your learning into 1 hour for the benefit of all of us. It was a great privilege. I was wondering, whether you were, just a scholar or also Buddhist practitioner. But I don't have doubt. At the end, you appear to be more Buddhist practitioner to me than a scholar, because in the very beginning, you said, there are two ways to look at the things, right? From scholar point of view, and secondly from practitioner point of view. And that also, I tend to think this a lot, because scholars tend to just rationalize the event and just cutting all the miraculous things or belief, and practitioner does just the opposite. And in this case, Heruka, right? After 400 years of passing of Milarepa, has written the biography of Milarepa. You later said he himself was the emanation of Milarepa. But from the point of view of a historian, if you are pure historian, could you say that that was the history?
Yeah.
It's more of your belief that he was the
Right.
emanation of Milarepa himself, right? And not only in case of Milarepa, but in case of Nagarjuna and even in case of Buddha, right? All the sutras started documented after, if I'm not mistaken, 100 years after Mahaparinirvana of Shakyamuni Buddha.
Right.
I'm not being very skeptical, but I don't know. To what extent the account is truly captured,
Right.
without any fanciful insertion or thinking Buddha would have said this but did not say, but let me write that.
Right.
Just like in the corporate life, the person, the secretary who writes the minutes of the meeting tend to control the
Right.
just
Right.
like historian being powerful than the time, because they can create the history kind of a thing, right? Just wanted to have your opinion or comment on that.
Yes, thank you. It's a very interesting question. It's a very important question, and honestly, it's a question that I've thought about for many years and still grapple with. And as a short answer, I would say that as a historian, you can ask many kinds of questions about one's material. And for me, the question, did Milarepa actually exist? Was there actually a person named Milarepa? Or was Songyun Haruka truly the reincarnation of Milarepa? Those are questions you could ask. But for me as a scholar, and also as a practitioner, but really as a scholar, they are not the most interesting questions. They don't give us an answer that is really meaningful. Instead, for me the question is, to the extent that we understand Milarepa as a real person, or Tsongyun Haruka as the incarnation of Milarepa, how did that affect the communities who read this story in the past and continue to read and understand and practice their story in the present? That is, what is the impact of the story itself? That to me is a much more meaningful kind of question to ask, and actually tells us much more about the tradition than the kind of veracity of the historical figure himself. And there are interesting parallels here to the study of other saints. So there's a long tradition of scholarship about the study of the lives of Christian saints. That literature is referred to as hagiography, or sacred writing. And there was for a long time the tradition of trying to understand who is the historical person, and did this person really exist at this time, and so on and so forth. But the later approach of most historians, most scholars of hagiography, is to rather understand that the communities that wrote the stories of the lives of those saints, and how those stories affected the religious practice, the religious beliefs, the religious sentiments of the communities where those stories were told. And there's one other parallel, maybe I'll say one more parallel, and that is with the study of the life of the Buddha. So, in the earliest scholarship, meaning Western European scholarship, not traditional scholarship in Buddhist communities, but the history of the scholarship of the life of the Buddha among European scholars was originally divided really into two camps. There was one camp that said that that the figure of the Buddha was purely mythological, and the people who wrote the lives of the Buddhas were drawing on traditions of ancient mythology, either Greek mythology or Norse mythology from Norway, Scandinavian myths. But really these are just stories that are told. There's no historical center to it. That was one camp. The other camp said just the opposite, that actually there was a historical Buddha, person called the Buddha, but over the centuries there were all sorts of mythical accounts of his miracles and all of these other accounts that could not be historical. They developed over time. And so they argued that the function of the scholar, the purpose of the scholar, is to dig below all of those myths, all of the miracles, because those are not true, to find at the center what is really true. My own feeling is that both of those approaches are incomplete, if not wholly misguided. That really we need to understand the totality of the tradition. Understand what we can from the perspective of history, but also understand what we can from the tradition, from the point of view of the living tradition and the power of the living tradition. Because to do only the history then denies the thousands of years of practice of places in which the stories of the Buddha were so powerful. Like, I mean, you only have to look outside to see that. Look outside our classroom to see the effects of that. It would be to ignore all of that, and of course we can't do that. But to ignore the side of history and scholarship then is to, in a sense, be blinded to another avenue of understanding the truth. And so the task, at least from my perspective, is to find a way to bring them into union, a kind of a middle path, maybe you could say, to bring both perspectives into union. And that's not always easy, and the path is not always clear. But I do think they're always important. And I actually end this my book, The Yogin and the Madman, making exactly this point, that we might take an approach to understand the life of Milarepa by diving back, starting from this account, and sort of peeling away the layers to earlier versions and earlier versions, like an onion. If you have an onion and you peel away the outer layer, there's another layer, you peel away that, there's another and another and another, but eventually you get to the end and there's nothing there. And to take that approach would leave you completely empty. There would be nothing, there would be nothing. It would be to deny the living tradition. Instead, I think we should take note of and to rejoice in the living tradition that does exist, that we draw inspiration from, and to understand its relationship to the sort of historical dimension. So that was maybe a longer answer than you expected, but it's a question that I really do grapple with myself. So thank you for that. Yes, please.
My name is Suman Sakya, and thank you so much for your lecture today. We are very much grateful for your deep study. So I would like to ask one thing. Today, I came to know that actually Changyun Heruka was his own incarnation by your lecture. So I would like to know that in his lifetime, Changyun Heruka's lifetime, who was his human root guru?
Yeah.
And his name, Changyun Heruka, who actually gave him to him?
Yeah.
Or he actually himself adopted that name?
Yeah.
So do you have any?
Very good question. So Changyun Heruka himself had many teachers. So in his early years, he was a monk. He was affiliated with a main monastery in Gyeonsei. You may have heard of the Gyeonsei Gungung Stupa. So there was a famous monastery. He trained there for many years as a monk. But in the end, I think his own instruction came through his inspiration, kind of directly in vision from Milarepa himself. And from the example of the previous masters, of the kind of Mahasiddhas of the past. The name Changyun Heruka is a name that he did use, but he did not he did not use that as his author's name. So the stories of the life of Milarepa and the collected songs, he used another epithet, a kind of moniker, a name that is Rube Genchen, so he who wears bone ornaments. And the image there, of course, is of the Mahasiddhas who wore bone ornaments like Tilopa, Naropa, and other great Mahasiddhas, because that was the model of practice that he adopted. And that was actually a point of confusion because he did not use his given name or even Changyun Heruka to sign these stories, that people for a long time, scholars in the West, did not understand who even was the author. So it was only after some study that we came to understand that.
So I just would like to know that in the Milarepa's life story, Marpa Lota was his root teacher. So,
Yes.
in the life story of Changyun Heruka, did he also have kind of
His original root guru would have been teachers from that monastery. I don't know that there's a single individual. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Just for curiosity, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I just like to know about, we have heard that the lifespan of the Guru Milarepa, he has been to Nepal as well.
Yes.
During your presentation here, I could learn the reincarnation Changyun Heruka. So I'd like to know learn whether Changyun Heruka stayed in Nepal or Milarepa himself. This is my curiosity. Thank you.
Changyun Heruka, he did come to Nepal, to Kathmandu Valley, but he really, during the later part of his life, spent most of his time staying in the retreat locations of Milarepa. And interestingly, Changyun Heruka, in his telling of the life of Milarepa and the collected songs of Milarepa, presented in a new way all of the places of Milarepa. He was the first to create sort of different collections of sacred sites associated with Milarepa. So he describes all of the places in the valley up from Kirong in Mangyo Gungtan. He describes other places like Lapshi and around there, and in Rongshar Valley. He also describes places like in Yomo Tabutsengizong. And he describes especially Tabutsengizong as a place which was prophesied in the past. But here again, I bring in my interest as a historian. I actually wrote a paper trying to understand the history of the meditation place in Yomo, Tabutsengizong, and how that name came about. And I won't rehearse it here. If you're very interested, we'll direct you to the piece that I wrote. But you can see that this was a kind of innovation of Tsongyun Haruka's. But he was very interested in documenting and creating a new map, a new kind of sacred map, or a map of sacred places associated with the life of Milarepa. And those then became important to pilgrims, and many Tibetan lamas coming down from Tibet would stay in them and would visit places in Kathmandu Valley and in Nishang and in Sum and Nubri. So that became part of the living tradition later on. So thank you. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you, Professor Sandy, for your wonderful lecture. Actually, throughout your presentation, I enjoyed a lot. I actually two pictures that draws my attention very much. Two pictures. One from the mural painting that you have shown, and one is the famous gesture.
Yes.
So it seems like from the mural painting, we have a completely different iconography than we used to see. I mean, we saw these days. So my interest about the transformation of the iconography. So what the aspects or what the circumstances or what's anything if you have find that causing the transformation of the iconographical representations.
Thank you.
One thing.
Yeah.
And another one is the 12 disciples, the 12 great disciples, the manuscript that you have shown. Do you think it's a kind of a fabrication for the people to give the authentication, or for giving the people to have a great devotion towards the Milarepa?
Yeah.
Do you think there is any kind of connection in between those, the fabricating the life of the Milarepa and the transformation of the iconographic, the formation?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the first question about the transformation of the iconography is a very interesting one. It's really perplexing, and I don't have a definite answer. I have theories, so I'll tell you my theories, but I don't feel like I can prove it yet, which is why I haven't published it. So if you look at representations of Milarepa before Tsongyun Haruka, I've never found a single instance of this gesture. So this gesture, I think, is quite late. And it really appears about the time of Tsongyun Haruka. So all of the early representations look something like this. Sometimes he's teaching, sometimes he's in meditation. You often see representations not as the central figure, but in the lineage. So as you know, many tankas have the central figure, but above there's the lineage of gurus. And Milarepa as a lineage master is almost always shown in meditation or in teaching. Never like this. So that transformation, I think, takes place around the time of Tsongyun Haruka. We also know that Tsongyun Haruka commissioned the creation of new tankas of Milarepa's life. Not as a static icon, but as a narrative mural painting, a life story painting. We don't have an example of that original painting, so we don't know what that looked like. But I have found some references in the biography of Tsongyun Haruka of his visions of Milarepa, and they're very detailed iconographic accounts. And they're a little bit vague about what his hands are doing. And so my theory is basically that this iconography comes from Tsongyun Haruka, because he was such an innovator in the literature. He also created a new kind of storytelling in images. I think it came from Tsongyun Haruka, and it's in the decades after Tsongyun Haruka that we start to see this new gesture appear. But again, this is kind of a theory. I haven't found very strong evidence for it. And the other question about the fabrication of this text is very interesting. So I want to understand your question. Was this text created in order to increase the devotion of their followers?
Yeah, kind of, yes.
And so when you say this text, I want to be very clear, do you mean this particular manuscript with the illustrations, or this kind of approach to long, extensive stories?
Yeah, it's a both can be looked at. I mean, the 12 great disciples, they were closely related,
Yes.
connected with
Yes.
the MILAREPA'S.
Yeah.
So these sort of texts were actually, tried in a history to make authentication
Yes.
of the, the guru,
Right.
or like just a fabrication,
Right.
what it could be.
So, okay, so another very good question, so thank you for that. Let me say a few things. So when we talk about the 12 great disciples, we can talk about two things. One is the text, and the text are the stories that were recorded by the authors. And the other is the version. So the version is the specific book that was written by a scribe at some time. And the text and the version are different. Right? The text was, I think the text of the 12 Great Disciples version, my theory is that it genuinely was assembled in perhaps about a generation after Milarepa died by his disciples and their own disciples. And I have some reasons for that that I've talked about in the book. There's another scholar who disagrees. He thinks this text is quite a bit later, but I think it's quite early. Maybe not while Milarepa was alive, but within a generation. So that still is quite early. And I think we can certainly say, if that is true, it was written in order to document the life and the teachings of their guru, and to inspire their followers to practice, for sure. That is one of the, it's one of the purposes, it's one of the benefits of biography, of religious or sacred biography, is to inspire disciples to practice and to show them how to practice. But there's another interesting answer to that question, and that is not the text, but the version. So the 12 Great Disciples, we have maybe 4 or 5 different versions, and they're all quite late. That means that this manuscript in the Newark Museum of Art was written only in the 17th century. And we know that for very interesting reason. It has lots of illustrations. There's one point when there's an illustration not of Mila or Marpa from the Kagyu sect of Buddhism, but of a Gelugpa monk. So the Gelug is another tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, the tradition of the Dalai Lama. It's very different from Kagyu. Sometimes they were even at war with one another. So there is a Gelugpa monk, a very famous monk who's considered the founder of the Gelugpa tradition. His name is Tsongkhapa. Why is there a painting, an illustration of Tsongkhapa in a story of Milarepa, a Kagyu text? Well, later we find another painting of a famous Gelugpa monk from eastern Tibet. His name was Kaldin Gyaltso. Kaldin Gyaltso was a monk, but he lived the life like Milarepa. In fact, he sang songs of Milarepa, and he also composed his own songs like Milarepa. He was so closely connected to Milarepa's tradition that in his portraits, as a monk, he's presented in the gesture of Milarepa. It's very interesting. And so we know that this copy, this text of Milarepa, was created not for a Kagyu monastery, in the tradition of Milarepa, but in a Gelugpa monastery as followers of this Gelugpa monk, as a means of inspiring that tradition from a very specific teacher. So, thank you.
Yes, sir. My one last question. As you know, in that Kagyu tradition, starting from Guru Tilopa, there were a lot of songs.
Yes.
From Guru Tilopa, Naropa, and Papa. So, in the life history of Milarepa, MILAREPA'S 100,000 songs, those Guru's songs were also included in those songs, or MILAREPA himself had those 100,000 songs?
I'm sorry, the last part of the question I did not understand.
In the MILAREPA'S 100,000 songs,
Yes.
Tilopan, Naropa, and Marpa's Guru's songs were also included in that song?
Oh, you mean in the Ocean of Kagyu songs?
Yes.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Yes. And then it extends up to the time of the Karmapa, and then later teacher Chogyam Trungpa produced a volume that included much later songs, even some of his own songs are in there too. So, yes. Yes, please.
My question is actually additional to the iconographic figure. So when actually does the MILAREPA start to create this company? Is it after time of Europa, or is it much later after the time of Europa's that the MILAREPA is depicted green in color? And that's one. And another is like I have heard that the earlier version of MILAREPA'S life story, it's not the father who dies, it's the mother who dies.
Yes.
So how does that affect the plot afterwards?
Yes, very good question. So the first question about iconography, do you mean what time does this new transformation of iconography happen?
Like we talked about his body posture.
Yeah.
I'm talking about his body color.
Oh, the color.
Yeah.
So what would be the first painted illustration?
In green.
That is a very good question. I don't have an immediate answer for you. That's a very good question. I'm sorry, I can't answer that. It's something I would be happy to think more about and talk to you later, but I don't have a good answer for you right now. I suspect, though, it will be around that same time. Actually, very good question. So now I have more research to do. Thank you for asking. And the second question, I'm sorry, the second question was?
About the earlier version where it's the mother.
Oh, the mother who dies, yes. So there are several versions, early versions, in which it's not the father who dies, but the mother who dies. And that's an important point because the events that set in motion the entire story of Milarepa's life is that his father dies and his aunt and uncle steal Milarepa's rightful patrimony. Milarepa's father is said to have been quite wealthy. While Milarepa was a young boy, all of that wealth was held by the aunt and uncle with the understanding that when Milarepa came of age, it would all go to him. And instead, his aunt and uncle steal all of that money, leaving Milarepa, his sister, and his mother as destitute beggars. And that event drives his mother to madness. She becomes so crazed by the greed of Milarepa's aunt and uncle that she sends Milarepa to learn black magic. And he kills, dozens of people from his family and casts hailstorms, and that eventually leads him to repent his misdeeds and then to go and find a guru and practice Buddhism. So that story is what sets the entire thing in motion. If his father does not die, it's his mother who dies, how does the story happen? And that's a very good question. So there are versions of the story in which the mother dies, not the father. Those versions are very short, and they actually don't have that long introductory section where he practices black magic, where he performs trials of building towers, or it says just like a sentence or two about that entire section. So in those early versions, for those authors, that story was not as important. And it's a very good question, and it tells us a lot about Songyun Haruka as an author and as an editor. So I talked a little bit about Songyun Haruka as an authoritative author, why he could write an authoritative biography, because he himself was Milarepa. But we can also think about Songyun Haruka as an author, as someone who is interested in writing not only an account that inspires faith, but a beautiful story, an engaging story, a dramatic story, like a modern novel that has characters with strong emotions, with very strong human qualities. And it's by developing the story of Milarepa's suffering as a child and the difficulties he faces undergoing trials of building towers. They're so dramatic. You feel Milarepa's suffering. It draws you in as a reader. It's a beautiful effect as an author. So this really, I think, demonstrates Songnyeon Haruka's greatness as an author. He was very interested in telling a well-crafted story. He was a great author, apart from being a great meditator. And I think that's a good example of that. So thank you.
Does any have any question?
Yeah, just I will say a few not comment,
Yes,
just
sir.
supplement.
Please.
So for the iconography, there is one text by one Newar by Jiwaram. Now it is in Kolkata, and now it is 15th century Nepali painting, Nepali sketchbook.
Yeah.
So I think it has also the iconography of Marpa, Milarepa, and other masters that are drawn by the Kathmandu Newar
And this
artist.
there's one famous with Marpa, Naropa, Tilopa,
Yeah.
but not Milarepa.
Yeah, there is also Milarepa.
So
Yeah, because this time we are working to make one cartoon book for Milarepa. One publisher in Bauta, Mukhum Bookshop, he want to make the pictorial book for Milarepa.
Yeah.
So we looked what does Milarepa look like, and what does Marpa look like. So we did research, and the original figure of the earliest figure of Milarepa and Marpa, because one famous sketch maker, Prime Swayambhu, Ratna Sagar Shrestha, he want to make the sketch, and then he asked us, oh, what was the original figure of Milarepa?
And he's presented like this?
Yeah, in that text, I have not seen that thing, but there is a written, there is script is Prachalit script. All the teachers' name or deities' names, Buddhist masters' names are written in Newari script. So maybe Prachalit. So I have the text. You can do research. That is also
very interesting. So we have something to follow
because
up
we
on.
are making we have collected most of the books published from China, and then we are making almost very close figure of Milarepa. And the second thing is for this hunter, the Kira Dorje from Manang. So if you visit the Braga in Manang, still you can see the ruins of the house of that Manange who was a hunter. And then now there is the 36 generations from that Kirarepa. Now they live in Kaski area nearby Pokhara. And then the last, the lineage holder is Achunda Gurum. His nickname is Lord Sri Gurum. So he has written one biography of this lineage of the Kira Dorje. And they practice this Gonpo Shakshipa and other means Mahakala, Taturbuja, and most of this Chakra Samvara. These are very common in Gurung community. They are migrated from Manang to this Pokhara area. So these are just my remark. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
I think this will give maximum and additional points to develop your research work.
Yeah, so one and a perfect illustration of why this kind of conversation and dialogue I think is so important. So thank you all for attending my lecture. Thank you for your attention and your questions. And before you leave, I brought a few things here that I'd like to make an offering. In the first, I'm so grateful to have another great scholar in Nepal of Milarepa and translator of the life of Milarepa. So, Milan Shakyaji, I'd like to make an offering of a copy of the life of Milarepa. So thank you for that. And also, I have some things for your college library I'd like to give. It's a copy of the translation in my book, but also of some articles I've published about the life and history of Milarepa. So I'd like to have these for the library here. So thank you so much. And I'll also just put up one more time. My email address is here if you ever have questions about anything I've talked about today, or if you have other questions, or if there's any way that I can help you in the future, I please encourage you to write to me. I'm happy to do whatever I can. So,
thank you so much. Thank you for your valuable lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, that's very kind. Oh yeah, maybe we can have a photo too.
No, this is written here. This certificate is hereby presented to Andrew Quintman for outstanding guest lecture on the history of MILAREPA'S biography held on March 22nd, 2023. We hope to get similar opportunities in coming days as well.
Thank you so much. Can we take one photo?
Group. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
It's very kind. Very kind. Thank you.
So,
this is me. So this is my new card. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Oh, wonderful.